Thanks for the introduction. Glad to be here. How many people have heard of open government products? You know? Okay, just today, just a couple of people this morning. Okay, good. Then we're in the right place. So I will go over what is open government products, why did it start, what's the genesis, what do we actually do, because it started in 2019, what did it actually do, and in terms of agile and less principles, what do we do and what happened as a consequence, because now 6 years later, what are the different stages that we went through, what are the different bottlenecks, and love to have a discussion about it. So I will leave some time for Q&A. Cool. So who am I? I studied engineering and then I realized I actually much like analytical problem solving. Spent some time at McKinsey working for a bunch of other governments, including the Indonesian, Malaysian, Ethiopian, and Papua New Guinean governments on education and climate change. And then I thought, you know what, I've helped so many other countries, I should come home and help my own country. And so then I moved home and joined the Singapore government, where I've been in that for the last 11 years. And so my in the Center for Strategic Future, so that's where the foresight experience came from. SkillsFuture, Ministry of Home Affairs, also doing future stuff. And then I branched out into tech, and so I was the founding head of people for Open Government Products back in 2019, and then I was responsible for scaling these principles of agile, both tech and how you run the org, to the rest of the Singapore government from 2021 to 2023. And then for the last 2 years, I spent it at Digital Industry Singapore. I was asked to take the learnings that I had in the public sector and bring it to the private sector. So how can we help startups that are based in Singapore to scale up, both in terms of creating jobs here, creating tech skills here, and create tech innovation here. So apply those learnings into the private sector, and then now I'm on my own doing that, and it's super fun to be less constrained. Okay, so this is what I'm going to be talking about. Actually, how do you do agile? Like, what's an actual real life example of agile design and what happened as a consequence of doing that? So who is Open Government Products? When we first started, we were a team of 20 people. This was taken when we were about 50 people. It's product people. It's predominantly product managers, software engineers, and designers. When we first started, we scaled up later to data scientists and product operations. But predominantly product people building products for the Singapore government that I used today, and you'll see some examples of them. So some of them you may encounter a form, so transactions where you fill out data that we don't want to necessarily go to the US or somewhere else via Google Forms. We have our own form provider, Scam Shield, to block scam calls and scam text messages. Go to gov.sg, a link shortener, government link shortener, so you can be assured that it's been created by somebody from government. And so if it is malicious, we will quite quickly be able to take that down, unlike a bit.ly link. SGID, which should be integrated with SingPass to make sure there's secure identity provision. Isomer is the website builder for government, and Redeem is the distribution of food vouchers. Actually for food and supermarket vouchers to all Singaporeans for the last couple of years, and it's an ongoing program. So those are some of the programs some of the products that have been built by the team, and also you may be familiar, for those of you in Singapore, with the vaccination appointment booking system during COVID. We were asked to build that out within a 2-week period. So that's who Open Government Products is. Why did it exist? So first, you may have heard that we want to be a smart nation. Whether we are or not, you can decide for yourself. And so what does that really mean? What does smart nation really mean? We try to define it a little bit tightly. And so the idea is, okay, the smart part has to be both the digital part, so you use technology really well and with specific outcomes. So citizens, businesses, government all have better, more efficient, more effective outcomes. And also, it's not just a transactional experience, but in fact, it should allow for the greater human-human connection, which some of the other speakers have also talked about. That is what should be enabled as a consequence of being a smart nation. But the reality, it's gotten better, but the reality is still there are significant chunks of government services that have issues in these 3 areas: security, reliability, and usability. You would have seen tons of news headlines about security-related issues, reliability-related issues. I mean, many services are down. There's a lot of planned downtime. I'm not sure if that should be the case in the current day and age, but there's a lot of planned downtime still, and of course there is some unplanned downtime. And the ratings for some government websites still leave a lot to be desired. Okay, so that's the state that we're in. And at the same time, though, there's that because of the rate at which technology moves, that means there are lots of opportunities for us to level up. Right? So cloud software solutions and AI I use all the time. There's a global talent war, as you all know. And so tech companies are what we're trying to adapt from and say, actually, can we learn from them? And can we not be so bureaucratic? Whether you're government, frankly, sometimes I think Google is as bureaucratic as the Singapore government and more so when I've interacted with them in the past. So it's not only an issue with governments, it's actually any large organization struggles with some of these things. And how do we make them more agile? So yeah, you can learn something from tech companies and so on, but it's hard. So people push back. They're like, no, here are some excuses or some reasons why I cannot. Right? Oh no, we need to do more security and therefore we don't want to go on cloud. We have so many different regulations that we have to follow, and we don't have enough expertise because we cannot compete with the salaries that the tech companies provide, right? So there are all these reasons that are proffered, and we said, you know what? Let's try anyway. Let's try and design something differently anyway, and say, what if we did this? What if we built an organization that operates like a modern tech company, but works for public good? What will happen as a consequence of that? So in 2019, we started Open Government Products. We had 3 key parts of a mission. Let's start by experimenting. Let's build it. Let's try it. Let's do a new data-driven performance management model. Let's do hiring and scale that by shorten the process by like 10x and see what happens. Can we actually do that and achieve significant quality in terms of our products and our people's experience? And then once we actually achieve that on our own in a small outfit, let's document that. Let's exemplify what that means and how that could be adapted. So if you write down not just the process, but the principles, then there's potential for that to be scaled up to different organizations with different appetites for change. And then finally, let's do it. Let's scale it up. Because why just do it for one small organization when Singapore government employs 150,000 people? It's the largest employer in Singapore. If a team of 150 compared to 150,000 people operate this way, actually the kind of outcomes we could get would be massive. So that was the genesis of Open Government Products. And so we set out to do these things. So 3 areas we experimented with: how do you build great products, how do you run good product teams, and then how do you run an organization. Because if you do these well, then these are the things that can scale. So how do we do it? 6 different things that we thought about with the overall organization. One is, where are we going with this? What do we want to achieve actually? People and rewards. How do we get the best people, and how do we keep them here and keep them happy? Basically, how do we organize ourselves? What processes do we use? What tools do we use? And what resourcing? How do we think about resourcing actually? How do we have a finite amount of money and people? How do we allocate them in a flexible way and make sure that they're working on the most important problems? So these are the 6 things that I will talk about. Let's see, okay, at speed, and then I'll leave you time for questions. So I mean, this is just the rough timeline in the early days. It takes a while to get started, as you can see. November 28, 2018 was when it was first. The proposal was drafted, but it's only a year later, basically, or almost a year later, when we first formed. And then we can start launching both people-related stuff, but also products very, very soon after that. So clearly something was working. And then we did hiring quite differently, actually. And so we achieved 3x reduction in the speed of hiring really quickly. I don't think it was rocket science. One is you just work at the different parts of the funnel. I mean, that's how I think about it. We did outreach in the beginning and built the brand of Open Government Products. One of the I think most cost-effective ways we did brand building is we just paid interns more. We just paid interns a greater salary, and then suddenly interns talk about who pays the most money and we're at the top of the list, and people are like, who is OGP? I want to go work there. And still, you don't have to pay them much at all. You pay them much less than any full-timer. And yet, they want to come back and work for you, and more than that, they have a good experience, they tell all their friends, and so you have a really big set of people who apply to you as fresh grads because you're a popular place to work. Right, so that's an example of something that you can do that actually the cost of that wasn't that big, but the effect was really large in terms of making us known as an employer of choice. So that was quite fun. Of course, you go down the funnel. You want to make sure that actually how to get signal. You use things like Codility. Actually, you do a coding test. This is all I think fairly normal now. But back in 2019, when we started doing some of these things, they weren't as common, and certainly still not so common in government or organizations that are slow at adopting technology. So we did that really quickly. We thought about risk management, so things like actually, do you really need to do reference checks? If you have confidence in the way in which you do your interviews and case studies and you actually have samples of work, how much do you really need to do a reference check and how much does that actually matter? And we concluded it doesn't really matter most of the time. If somebody is really borderline, you're thinking about fit and you're thinking about previous experience, you might do that, but that's very, very rare. So we don't end up doing reference checks a lot of times. Do we do education certificates? Not really. I mean, because if you can move towards skill-based and assess the skills much more accurately and much quicker, actually, it may not make sense to do different kinds of reference checks. So these are some of the things that we did in order to move quite quickly. And it's the same with medical screening. Medical screening anyway is quite basic, and it wouldn't turn up stuff anyway. So we're like, well, just skip it. It'll be fine, and it's been fine. We didn't have any issues with that. Okay, so. Next step, people and rewards. Actually, in many organizations, there's a popular way of doing performance in a normal distribution. So you assume a small percentage of people do great, large majority of people do average, and a small majority of them do poorly. And so that's the way it operates. And I think that is largely true, but if you operate in that way, and I personally think it's a bit of a lazy way to operate, if you do that and do not properly define what good performance is like, that's the danger of just following a normal distribution by the book, right? So what we did is we said, you know what, let's be really, really clear of what it means to be at different levels for each role. So for software engineer, what does it mean to be a junior software developer? What does it mean to be an associate? What does it mean to be a senior software engineer? And you have different descriptors, which I will show, that demonstrate actually this is what it means. And if you follow these, then you are performing at the next level. And so if you want to perform at the next level, you actually know what this looks like. Right? And then you can debate with your manager whether or not you're performing at that level, but at least you have something specific to debate about, and you're not being defined by some subjective random criteria that changes month on month or year on year, right? So you know the criteria by which you're being assessed. And so that proved pretty helpful for linear career development, but it also was really helpful in thinking about branching out to different roles. So if I'm a software engineer and I want to be a product manager, I can read the career scheme of a product manager and figure out actually what are the gaps that I need to close if I want to be a really good product manager, and start building towards those, or vice versa. And we had people who experimented with and then we developed ways in which you can experiment with different roles for 6 months, almost an internship, and we'd freeze your salary essentially for those 6 months. And after 6 months, you can get assessment at what level you would be if you joined that scheme, and then you decide. You want to become a product manager at lower level, your choice. And vice versa. You would probably be a low level because that's not the level you trained at. But some people are committed to making the switch, and so they would do that, and then they would excel over time. And that actually ends up keeping people in the same organization, because often people, I myself, the longest job I ever worked was here, because I created my own role 2 years later and I switched roles. Right? And so that wouldn't exist in most organizations. You're kind of too narrowly defined in a linear career path. Everywhere else I leave after 2 years, right? Because I was like, oh, well, I'm not growing enough. So we would do that, and then you would make sure that you would have the schema, but it has to be used. It has to be used at the point of hiring. It has to be used at every point of performance management. So all the data and feedback you collect from the individual, from managers, and from their peers, all are along the lines of the career schema. So based on those specific points, that's how you evaluate what level somebody's performing, and then you can make a clear judgment that somebody's performing at level, above level, and how far above level, and then you can figure out the bonus. So we did formulaic bonuses. The bonus is not subjective. If somebody is performing 1 level up, they get the salary 1 level up. If somebody's performing 2 levels up, they get salary 2 levels up. And if they're performing down, they get salary 1 level down. That's basically how we did it, roughly speaking. For a while we did it midway, so you get 2/3 the bonus, and then we moved it to like, you know what, forget that. Let's just do it. You're earning whatever level you're performing at, you're earning at that level. So that's how we did that. and then because you have the schema and the performance, then you are talking about the gaps quite clearly the person has, and then you can figure out how do you make sure you close those gaps, and then that's where the learning part comes in. And it has to be a combination of learning on the job, so your manager, your peers can coach you, but also if you need to go for courses, then you're absolutely entitled to do so and make the time to do that. Okay? So these are examples of the tracks that we had. So the different levels. We broke up the levels into sub-levels mainly because if you write the levels well, it's not so easy to move from a junior to a core and a core to a senior. And you don't want somebody to feel frustrated because they're stuck with no sense of where they would get there. So what the sub-levels do, they're not defined individually, but the idea of sub-levels is you give people a sense of progression. So they would have a salary upgrade, and so we do salary points rather than salary ranges. So everybody who's like, let's say a data scientist core 1 would be earning exactly the same amount of money, right? If you're performing at that level. But if you're outperforming, then of course you would earn more. And so you don't have to outperform by entire level, but if you're like 1/3 of the way to senior data scientist, you'd be earning core 2. If you're 2/3 of the way, you'd be earning core 3, and if you go all the way, then you'd earn here. So that's the idea behind this, and so you give people enough of a sense of progression so that they know that they're on the right track, and they're like, okay, I'm committed to reaching the next level, and then when they get there, you're like, okay, great, you're there. So we have these for each of them. Of course, we also develop them for corporate roles, for policy roles, for product ops, as there was critical mass to do that. And then, so I talked about this a little bit. Actually, you want to make sure that performance is fair. So actually, the standard we lock down on paper, right? You can iterate the sessions after the performance management is over for the next 6 months, but you would do it then, specific, and then honesty. So one of the issues with peer feedback typically in a system with normal distribution is you are competing against your peers, right? It's normal distributions, by definition, only somebody can be at the top. I'm incentivized to rate down my peers because there's only some people going to be at the top. So that doesn't really encourage honest feedback, that model. And so if you don't declare a normal distribution and you say everybody's measured on an absolute scale rather than relative scale, then you have nothing to lose or gain by inflating or deflating somebody else's scores. And so you got to make sure that the way you design your system is aligned with the incentives that you put out there. So that's what you're going to do. And so that's how we designed that, and that's how we were able to get a bunch of peer feedback as well. So this is what you end up with. You end up with somebody who has like, this is a weighted distribution essentially of like, hey, here's the feedback, and it's weighted based on confidence levels. So that's how much I work with this person. So if I worked more with Joel, for example, then my weightage of your work would count for much more than somebody who doesn't really know you much at all. But they might give you some useful other feedback, and so you want to capture the qualitative nature of the feedback. And so we would have that, and so you would be able to see what's the distribution of your scores and how people perceive you. But ultimately, you have a weighted assessment, and then the manager makes the final call to say, actually, do I agree with that or not? And the manager can overrule this, but there's calibration and so on. So other people will read the same performance packet, and the manager can be overruled by a group of other managers who say, hey, actually, no, you're behaving unfairly, and if we compare people across different functions, this is not the same judgment, and therefore we're going to overrule you. So that's the model in which we operate. But you would see that this is all very much in line with the career schemas, right? So it's very clear. It's kind of like, here's the technical stuff, here's the management leadership, and here are the things that you need to do in terms of engineering leadership that are quite aligned with the career schema, and then there's a paragraph on the manager's feedback. So that's how the feedback is presented to the individual. It's very action-oriented, so you know what you should be doing and you should be focusing on. You don't want to overload this too much. Anything more than that is very difficult for people to process and actually take action on. So anything more than this, we found to be too much. Okay, and people basically found this system so we asked them, actually, how do you find this in terms of experience, fairness, how much effort it took, Of course, it's kind of painful, right? If you fill out a lot of peer feedback for people, it can be quite painful and time consuming. But then we changed that over time and said, hey, actually, instead of a lot of people, let's just make sure we have breadth and depth. So let's make sure people are evaluated by people from different functions. So if your engineer is not just evaluated by other engineers, but also by product managers and designers. And let's make sure there's depth. Engineers rated by somebody more senior, more junior than them. And same for the other functions. And so as long as we have that covered, we can have fewer number of people evaluating them, but we have similar quality of feedback that emerges, and so that worked out quite well. I'm gonna skip this and move on to structure. So structure, I think interestingly, tech teams are really small. They're like one product manager, 3-4 engineers. We find that with large product teams, what ends up happening is the distribution of responsibility gets very diffused. Often there aren't people who take responsibility. There's confusion about who is going to be doing what and who is accountable for stuff. And so we would break people into teams, and even these are all like fairly large products. I'll show you stats for Forum later, but these are all products that over 100 agencies use, a few thousand users easily, probably in the hundreds of thousands of users now who use this and 100,000 forms for sure. And so you can still actually build this stuff with few people, and this is even before AI. So at like 50 people, actually it's still quite flat. This is a bit like Jensen Huang, I think, there's like 50 people who report directly to him, which worked for a short while, and then we're like, hey, you know what? If we're thinking about scaling, which we need to think about middle management, which I'll come to towards the end in OGP 2.0. Yeah, so processes, actually, what are some of the processes that we do? We try to avoid bottlenecking as much as possible. So the more decision making you can push down to individual product teams, actually the better. And as long as the product teams are super plugged into the users and what they need, that would work pretty well. We have these no-fault postmortems. So anytime something bad happens, we don't ask who did it. We just ask what happened and what are the fixes that are involved. Can you share with the team, not from a point of blame, but so there's a point of learning. And so that everybody thinks about actually what are the specific things that we will do in the future to stop incidents like this from happening. So that's something that we maintain quite tightly, so that other teams don't suffer from the same issues. Hackathon. So if you want to have innovation in governments, you got to let people try technology and see what they can do with it, and then they will be amazed and they will be champions of it rather than you trying to force it down people's throats. And so every year we do a hackathon where we collect real problem statements from people in government to say, hey, what are the issues that you're struggling with? There's no commitment that we'll build something, but the ones that we find interesting, we will corral together a team and within a month build something. And this is all like pre-AI, right? I mean, now I've actually seen hackathons where if you invest in good tooling for your teams, in 24 to 36 hours, actually, you would come up with the similar level of prototypes that it took us a month to come up with, and with people who probably less software development skill. So that was super cool. But the idea was actually, let's see if we should commit our how do we if I fast forward to a resourcing, how do we know that we're committing our resourcing in the right place? You first want to build prototypes and see actually what are the problems you're solving, what are the impact that you potentially might have, and if you have a huge spread of those and you have many different things you could invest resources on, then that's what really ensures that you're spending your time, energy, money, manpower on the things that matter. You can only do that if you have a plethora of options. If you have only a few things, then I feel like you'll never be sure that you're investing in the right thing because you don't know what you're missing. And so that's why we do this annually. And the reality is, over time, only between 10 and 25% of new products end up getting funded, properly resources. But at any point that there is a plateauing of some other products, for some reason that's no longer gaining traction, at least in your drawer you have a whole range of things that you could fund and you could develop and you could push. And so that keeps everyone on their toes in terms of development, and if things aren't moving fast enough, then you actually know what the alternatives are. You don't have to invest more resources into a sunk cost already. So that's the advantage of a hackathon. A bunch of these products actually made it out of hackathon back in the COVID era. I can talk about maybe one or two of them. Postman is essentially a communication tool between government and residents of Singapore. So if you want to communicate your message to a group of people who say got a hospital booking or medical appointment booking, then actually, and there's a bunch of different people because you're doing vaccinations, then actually you could upload an Excel sheet, a bit like MailChimp, but it would be formatted properly and it would have all the recipients and it would come out from the same government.sg SMS or email, and it would be pretty solid. Redeem was also from Hackathon. So Redeem was the CDC voucher. So this is the food voucher that's all Singaporean households get. Actually, it started because people want to distribute at a mosque meals. And they needed some way to figure out how to allocate vouchers to people. And so that's how it started. Many of the pilots started small. Form.gov.sg, which most of you would have interacted with, nobody wanted to digitize forms in the beginning, but somebody whose job it was to report where pigeon droppings were falling so that you could figure out how to allocate resources and had to do a lot of manual forms, got really fed up. And he said, sure, why don't you digitize my forms? And we started with that guy. And then over time, people were like, okay, well, this makes sense. And we built more and more features, and then over time it gets more and more use cases. So many of these all started small, and then it starts small, and then the use cases grow over time, and then they expand. So that's the advantage of Hackathon. You can start small and see if it's useful. Next, processors. So I'll just do one or two of these. I think government and many large organizations have a lot of regulations. You want to create some space to deviate from the regulations to see if there's a better way. One of these things that exists is called IMAID, Instruction Manual 8, which essentially is a large regulation of how you need to do security. It's very process-based. There are a couple of hundred steps. It takes typically a few months to comply with each of these steps. And OGP said, you know what? Why don't we, at the end of the day, be tested based on outcomes? Why don't we do vulnerability assessment and penetration testing for our products? And let's see if there are any major issues, we'll remediate them, and then let's go, let's launch, right? So let's be tested based by outcomes than by process. And that process can be much shorter. And if you do that and the leaders are willing to sign off on that, somebody has to be willing to sign off on that risk, but you know that the residual risk is small, then let's go with that process. And so that proved to be a good process for at least for people who are trusted and you've built products before and you have some experience and you know what you're doing, then you're okay to go with that process, right? So there is governance, but it's just governance based on outcomes rather than process. And so that can be one way to really speed up outcomes. So that's one example. And then we went to document stage I hated the most, but very necessary, especially if you want to scale some of these practices to other teams and communicate the reason why you do things. There are always new people joining who want to understand why it is the way you do the things you do, and so documentation helps with that. So we have documents for everything pretty much, why we do, how we build products, how we run the org, and a whole bunch of stuff. This is, I think, fairly normal now, maybe less so normal then, but we use a bunch of cloud software now. I'm sure you can string a bunch of this together with different agents, but this is much better than trying to build everything in-house yourself. We use tools like Slack, not just Microsoft. What else we do? This is in the COVID era, I think the main point is not just that we use a bunch of different tools, it's like we're always experimenting with new tools. So in COVID times, we experimented with both Discord and Notion to figure out actually which video call platform should we use. And people actually preferred the specific interface of Notion for one-on-one calls. But then we said, let's think about what is more important for the organization. And we thought actually one of the things you miss in COVID in a remote, as you move towards more remote work, is a sense of what everybody else is up to. What are they working on? What are the water cooler conversations that are happening? You missed that out. And Discord had the advantage of making it public who was conversing in what channel at what time. right? And so we said actually we will use Discord rather than Notion because of that feature. And because that's the value that we want to encourage is actually people just jumping into different conversations and different product channels to figure out actually what is happening with these products. And so that's why we ended up using Discord. So if you're clear about your values, then when you experiment with tools, you know how to measure them and you know how to decide what to use eventually. Yep, so that's Zoom, Discord, okay. Final one, okay, good, I'm on time. Final one is resource allocation. And interestingly, I found that we use two different sets of resource allocation principles for budget and for manpower. So for budget, really, it was about, you got to think about scale. I mean, many organizations have this. As you scale up the budget as required, the level of how onerous it is to get the approval is significantly higher. So actually, in the beginning, you want to experiment small and prove that stuff works, because then when you need to deal with the more onerous procurement processes, at least you have a strong basis for doing that and scaling that up, right? So you would do this. And so in the government, so that's one thing that you consider. So in government, you could easily get funding for experiments, and then when you scale it up, you're like, okay, well, we've tested this experiment, it works. Here's where we want to. Here's the traction that we have in terms of people who want to do it. And then of course the next question is, when do people start paying for it? Because if government agencies have to pay, then they have to do procurement too. So and that is also painful. And so if they have to pay us, it's painful too. So we're like, okay, well, at what point do we start charging them? Because in the beginning, it just doesn't make sense. So we got to think about that. So we think about that. We think about actually the priorities. So which are gonna result in public good. And to be frank, unlike many private sector companies which operate on thinking about profit, it is much harder for us to measure. I mean, if you think about different kinds of public good, how many young undergraduates are employed, or people who have just graduated are employed is the topic we're thinking about now. If you could boost that versus like reducing the number of people who come out of prison and go back to prison, the recidivism rate. How do you compare these two things? Right? These are not comparable in the way that their money is comparable in terms of profit and loss. So these are not so easy to determine. Actually, these are more complicated questions to answer. But ultimately, people have to make a decision. People in leadership have to make a decision about how you allocate resources based on the most amount of public good, and then based on that you allocate resources. And this essentially says, hey, actually, you want to plan your budgets for the next year because you know the experiments that you want to run, so you would do that. And then if you track the metrics, then you can use the metrics to then help you figure out which of these is really going to be doing quite well in scaling up public good, and then you allocate longer term budgets towards those that you think have more potential. So that's the way in which we allocate the budget, pretty agile. And then similar for manpower, it's like actually where do we need people based on the metrics I identified earlier, based on impact. Where do we need this? How long do we need this? Based on how long we might think we're going to develop a product. Actually, what do people need? So based on a collation, so we would collate the feedback, right? We would develop all the performance management summaries anyway. So like, okay, what do people actually need to develop in, and how do we make sure we design stuff that fits in what people needs? And then finally, what do people actually want to do? Do we have a lot of engineers or product managers? Do we have vice versa? Can we make sure that we fit what people actually want to do? OGP is in healthcare a lot of time because a lot of former doctors came and joined OGP and said, I want to work on healthcare. And that's why we have healthcare practice. Right? Otherwise it's hard to join areas which you don't have a lot of expertise and passion in. So OGP very much moved based on the different passion that people had. And same for me, I had a passion for scaling up the work OGP did to other government agencies, and so I pushed for and created a new division called Partnerships to do this. And if I wasn't there, it probably would have happened much later, if not at all. So that's how we do people allocations, and we did this on a quarterly basis. How do we do this? Started super manually, so each person has like, in theory, 3 post-its. You could divide your time between we later went into a major and a minor project, and then so you would work 2/3 of your time on a major project, and you would work a minor on some other project. And we made electronic, and then it's just to say like, hey, this is one set of time, but over time it could change quite dramatically if there were needs in the organization. So you see people move into their 3 post-its into either all three or like a 2-in-1 kind of model. Okay, so how did that work? If we thought about all that stuff, we built more products. So if I go back to my original 3 issues with government systems, usability, reliability, and security, of course the unsaid one that is cost, right, which we always care about since it's taxpayers' money that we're using. If you look at Go.gov/Sri, the link shortener, actually you get a ton of different links that are created and a lot of people clicking on links. Usage is really the main way we measure. So you look at user experience also, it looks like pretty clean. Over time, as we increase the feature set, you have 40,000 officers who have created forms. This is grown much more now. This is some old data since I left the org. And then there's 50 million form submissions already, just in a small time frame alone. Isomer, the website template generator, aside from the sites, it's now even more sites are on. All the school sites are now there. A lot more government sites have gone onto Isomer, and so you have a ton of site visits. If you look at the downtime on Isomer websites, which are static websites, because you don't actually need dynamic websites most of the time, the downtime for Isomer is 100x less than a lot of more dynamic, complicated sites. Our uptime, downtime is really good, basically. And if you look at the cost, actually the cost of building on Isomer or even the parking app is actually, which serves all the cars that parked in Singapore at pretty much all times, is just $2,500 a month, and so it's pretty cheap to do stuff using a set of SaaS tools. This is now normal, but at the time it's not normal to be able to build a website this quickly. So we moved it quite down, and so you don't even need technical expertise, but because you templatize this, anybody could really do that really quickly. And then we really scaled down the rollout time of products to the public by quite a lot. Okay, so this is the part I want to go to, and then this is the last part I'm going to break for questions. So this is what I presented was the foundation phase. This is the formation of OGP. For the first 2 years, we were building, we were experimenting, we were trying stuff. After that, we were growing. We grew from 50 to 180 people. That is a significant growth where you need a lot of middle managers. So things changed pretty dramatically. So some of the things we thought about is actually we have more than 10 product teams now. How do we make sure that there is consistency and quality control? So actually you have to think about middle management, you have to think about control and decision making, and how do you have communication in a much larger organization? How do you make sure that you continue to have good products? Because if you've already done the platform products, we had forms, we had identity, we had payments, we had vouchers. So there's a lot of your platform products that are going to result in growth. What's the next phase? And so the next phase for us was actually thinking about what are specific vertical products that that might make sense for a particular domain, healthcare, education. Let's go deeper into these. Let's examine legacy systems and see what makes sense. And then finally, as we've demonstrated that we're able to deliver around usability, reliability, security, and cost, actually how do we then scale it up? How do we think about new ways of working with government so they experience what it's like to be in OGP? So we kind of hothouse some people in OGP actually. We're like, hey, why don't you just hang out here 1 day a week for a few months in a somewhat structured way so that you can experience what it's like to work here and bring that back to the organization. We also seconded people out to different parts of government to say, actually, can we figure out if we can take some of these principles and go outside of government and build that out. So we tried all of these things for a couple of years, and then what's happened the last year or two is kind of a, I guess if you've heard of the pioneer settler town planner thing, it's like now we're thinking at scale. OGP's been appointed as the digital public goods representative for Singapore in terms of the Global Digital Public Goods Alliance, and so actually how do you scale internationally, not just in Singapore, but how do you scale some of these products? So how do you do transformation of large organizations actually when people can get frustrated by slow rate of change? Actually, if you really want to do change, it is going to be hard. So the question is, are you committed or not? And so we try to get more signals like, are people really committed to doing change even if it's going to be really hard? and are you gonna stick to it? And then for people who came from the private sector in the earlier stage, actually we found a lot of people were attracted by the value proposition, but they didn't find the way OGP operated fit what they were accustomed to, and many of them left. So during the big tech layoffs, actually OGP hired 100 people from the private sector in a 6-month period, most of them from FAN, and many of them ended up leaving because they didn't quite understand how to switch their context from a large MNC, a large tech organization, into government. And so then we spend more effort thinking, actually, how can we get people to experience a little bit more and understand a bit more about how government thinks, how government works, how government communicates, so that actually you're set up more for success. So it's not just onboarding, which we had already, but actually can we engage both with people in OGP who are government experts, but also with government people early and often, so that they get what it takes and what it means. And then finally, actually, because we had that rapid rate of performance management cycles of 6 months, actually there was an internal pressure for people to feel like they wanted to perform, and that resulted in significant burnout. And so what we did to combat that is say we want to keep the principles of having enough data and having the peer feedback and so on, but we want to reduce the pressure on people to feel like they have to just consistently perform. And so we moved, like many of the tech companies also moved from 6 month to 12 month, and we followed suit. And so we also moved from 6 month to a 12-month cycles. And the other thing we did is we found that actually, even though we have the schema and it's really cool, and it's focused on individual impact, you're always optimizing for individual performance, it didn't always correlate with the entire product performance. And so we said, actually, let's also do product scores, product performance scores, and then those will help us to figure out if the combined team is actually making a difference, and you should be scored not just on how you individually are doing, but on how your whole team is doing. And so in parallel to doing individual performance assessments, we did we just started doing product performance assessments, so that those can be considered together, and then your combined performance is a score of both your own and your teams. Okay, cool, great. That was a whirlwind. That was a lot. So I am going to stop here and take questions. Thanks.
Sorry, Rahul.
Yes, right.
Hi, Rahul. Thanks for the presentation. I think it's really fantastic, the OGP growth in the last 6 years. So, to be frank, OGP has always been like a mixed unicorn. It's like a mythical unicorn. You hear about it, you don't see them talking, etc. So thanks for coming up. So what I'm really curious is that this particular 2 columns, right? Do you feel, in your personal opinion, is there a danger, or do you see this potential of normalization of the workforce?
Can you elaborate, like which 2 columns and
like for example, like you mentioned that the ex-bank employees, right?
Yes.
Started kind of leaving because of the mismatch in expectations, for example. Or what did you see thereafter in terms of hiring, for example? Did you have to choose from a different pool of candidates? And sort of, did it have any impact on the outcomes of the digital products and services that was delivered by OGP?
To the first question, do we have to select differently? The answer is yes. Right? It doesn't mean that different people will end up getting in, but you got to change the hiring process, because you want to set the expectations right up front at the point of hiring. So at the point of interviewing, you have to let people know, hey, this isn't going to be easy. You can't just, if we get internal approval in OGP, unlike Facebook, internal approval you can do that, right? But if OGP internal approval, but actually the client, the government agency who actually is the product owner, doesn't agree, actually it's not going to move, right? And so are you actually committed to really understanding their problem statement and solving their problem statement, and not just shipping a product? Right, so we had to test for signals of like actually things, for example, things like actually, what do you think is wrong with the way the Singapore government operates right now? What is something that you're frustrated about? What would you change? And I think in the past, maybe if people didn't have a strong answer and hadn't thought about that question that much, maybe it'd be okay. If the technical skills are solid, it's still okay. But I think what we realized is people actually have to be committed to this, to the idea of really building public good. And that is represented typically in a way that they have already interfaced with the system in some way and either had some frustrations or some good experience, but that is something that's on their mind. So we would have to hire based on that. So fair people could still qualify, certainly, but that would have to be something that preoccupies them. Because you need that preoccupation and some level of obsession to get you through these really challenging moments. Because if not, you are definitely going to get frustrated. So do you have the goals and the core of what you want to do and why you came here in the first place? Because if you have that, that's what will get you through it. As for the quality of OGP products, I will continue to use external validation and in part processes to make sure that the quality continues to sound. Arguably, there's still a high variance, I think, depending on the maturity of product, where it's at, the partner that you're working with, and how open they are to working with you on the problem. I think sometimes many agencies think of working with technical people as vendors. They say, I got the solution, this is the solution you build for me. But it might not be the right solution for their problem. And so if they are unwilling to engage you on the problem itself, then it's going to be quite difficult.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So maybe before I rob everybody of the chance to ask you a question, maybe you have one last one. I'm always curious around the, maybe you can share some of the challenges around valorization of like OGP across the agencies. Maybe you can talk about a major challenge, like you just named one major challenge already. Do you think there are others that can potentially kind of like be a sort of like you can sidestep, for example?
Yeah, I mean, probably if I was still in service, I might not say this, but I think one of the challenges that I found I was quite sad about to experience is I thought that, so first I thought, let's try a revolution approach, right? Let's say if people see how different things can be, they will be so excited and they will push for revolution in their agencies. Right, that's what I thought first. And so I let people sit in OGP and design programs where people were allowed to use tapping on existing programs. People could just sit in OGP, experience it, see our design, see our documents, experience our processes, and then design a project. Those mostly got killed at middle management. Because the middle management said, this is not urgent, not our organization priority, killed it. Then I said, never mind. Then what's the organization priority? Who will know best? The top. I just go straight to the heads of the organizations. Went to the PERMSECs, went to the PEs. And I think what I was sad to find was that actually even for them, organizational development and capability building and agility is not top priority. I think it's a structural and systemic issue. If you look at the incentive structure and the way our systems work, these people move every 3, 4, 5 years. They're not incentivized to think long term. If you look at the KPIs and the reporting lines, the PERMSECs report to the ministers are in charge of a specific domain, right? And so they score them. That's about it. You're not really incentivized to collaborate across ministries or across divisions. And so any of that happens because of social connections, which are intentionally formed, but it happens because social it doesn't happen because of structural incentives. So those are always going to actually be barriers towards both building an organization that's agile and is able to deliver and cross-cutting collaboration, because it just isn't structurally incentivized, and that's not what people are geared to. So I found that I would meet PERMSECs and they would say, can you build this product? And I was like, yeah, but you can transform your organization. And they're like, no, why don't you just build this tool? So that was the response that I found. And then I did find a sweet spot. The sweet spot is sort of at the director level, where they understand enough flexibility to be able to actually commission projects and new ways of working. And they were close enough to ground to feel like, okay, like I understand that this could make a difference. So that's where we saw some success. But it was after trying the revolution and the evolution approach that didn't really work that I had to find this third approach.
Right, thanks. Thanks a lot.
Hello. I'm not for a background. I'm not a Singaporean, so I'm not familiar with how the government works.
Yep.
I want to ask about the rewards and incentive.
Okay.
Does the fact that you are serving a public purpose plays a role in easiness, how you do rewards and incentive. What I mean by this is, in a private sector, the rewards you give to your employee closely tied with how the company performs. I'm not sure how that does it plays a role with how you reward your employees.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, we can't give equity, of course. We'll come to your options. We can't give equity, of course. That is one of the big differences between us and startups. Number one, and number two, there is a rough agreement or a social compact that if you work in government, you should expect to take a pay cut from the private sector, all right? Because you are actually working on awesome stuff. You're working on like social good stuff, and so that should compensate for your salary to some degree, right? Which I also buy in. I mean, in the service for 11 years, and so that in a way is a bit of a reward. But other than that, ultimately, it's still the same overall principle that the performance based on impact is still what is going to matter in terms of when you calculate a person's reward. So it is the level that you're performing at, and it is determined primarily by the impact that you're creating. Sure, it's based on competencies that we as an organization are betting on, that if you're better at these competencies, you produce more impact. That's why I say invest in these competencies, because you need a roadmap. But ultimately, if you're providing that impact, then you are rewarded more. And that was the first phase, and it's kind of a pure individual-based thing. And the minor adjustment that's being made now and that exists in the government overall is like, yeah, if your organization or your product overall is doing better and you have some amount of control over that, then actually that should weigh into your performance. And so we're just starting to try that out with the product reviews at the same time as the performance reviews now, so that can happen in a tighter way, and it wasn't being done in that way before. Yeah. Okay. Yes?
This will be the last question.
Thank you. I had a question, but just something interesting. You said that why you would pay less for someone working in government versus private, right? But generally the view at the top has been that you want to pay your ministers the highest and that and they're better off than working in private. So why doesn't that same principle apply going down, right? You want the smartest people working for the government. Why is it an or, not an and? Which it can be, I believe. But that was not my question. Just something.
Yeah, I thought so. I'll respond to that anyway, but yeah, go ahead.
What I found interesting was the way the teams are set up, right? So you have these, in one of the charts you had like half product managers, half designers, half something like mixed bag. How do you, like, are you continuously working on the product? Is the same team working on the product, or are like people just moving and trying to build other things, because there's only so much someone would build, right? Plus there's domain expertise that someone has already now built, context and all of that. So how does that scale?
Yeah, cool. So in response to the very quick response to your first question is actually the government would argue that it is a pay cut for the ministers to work as ministers compared to what they would be earning as doctors and lawyers. So that is what the government would say in response to it. So it's the same principle actually. Okay. And in response to this question, actually it's a perennial question. Like actually, what do you do when products scale, essentially, right? And so is it the same team that maintains it, or is it do you pass it off to a different team? And for the first sort of phase, actually the view was that it's just the same team that maintains it, but once a product is in maintenance mode, it should require very little resourcing for the team that built it, because they know the code base pretty well, and so it shouldn't require much work from them, and so they would go on to work on other products, but they would also be responsible for maintaining something like parking, for example. That was the view for a long time. I think over time, as we scale the number of products, as you have more attrition, that this naturally happens over time, you're like, okay, well, maybe that's not quite so sustainable. And so we brought in a function called product operations that's meant to be able to do both the maintenance, but also by talking to users quite regularly, understand if we really should be building some different features, should be prioritizing things if there are common pain points and addressing those as well. So the product ops folks are a little bit of the bridge and can support with that. The head of OGP's view is like, in theory, you should automate as much as possible and do maintenance as much as possible, so that you don't actually require maintenance teams, because to hand over a code base to an entirely new team and expect them to understand and maintenance actually will take a lot more resources. This is an annual question that gets asked if this is something that's going to change. So it's not something that's changed yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if at some point there are people who focus more on maintenance. I think the bigger issue actually is, is maintenance actually rewarded and recognized as much as new product that's building, right? And at some points, there is a myth going around that like nobody cares about maintenance. You'd rather ship a feature on a new product, so try and get off, any old products and like go move to a new product that seems pretty sexy and like go build a feature on it, because then you say, hey, I'm doing this really cool stuff. And we wanted to address that pretty quickly. And so one of the things that we do is anytime somebody gets promoted, there's a short write-up, like a 1 or 2 paragraph write-up on why that person got promoted to any level for any role. And so we wanted to kind of showcase a little bit more some examples of people who got promoted when working a lot on maintenance of products to dispute this myth, basically, right? So I think we showcase that a little bit in front of the entire organization. Say actually, I mean, subtly, right? You don't explicitly say this is concern, but you say, hey, this is why this person got promoted. Like, we just want to flag this. This person, you did a lot of maintenance work. Their products were much more reliable. They did great migration work. The projects are much more secure right now, and we appreciate that, and therefore this person got a promotion. They showed diversity of skills and so on. So actually to understand the underlying issues. And so for us, those are some of the underlying tensions that we had in the organization. And then after that, people are like, okay, well, maintenance work is clearly valued here. It's okay if I spend some of my time doing maintenance, because that is valued, and so then you begin to be okay with it. So that's how we address that issue.
Thanks. And also was asking the question in the context of like when you said that now product teams would be measured on the success of the product, right? So that means that the team would stick to that product maybe longer, right?
Yeah, I mean 6 to 12 months. 6 to 12 months. So whatever you deliver in that 6 to 12 months.
All right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. All right. Thank you very much, everyone.